Hello, and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover the different opinions to mail-in voting in the USA. Over the course of 2020, it has become increasingly clear that more Americans than ever before will be voting by mail in the November presidential election, and as such, the debate over mail-in voting has become more prevalent than ever before. On the whole, the Republicans, spearheaded by Trump, oppose mail-in voting, while the Democrats tend to support it. The aim of this episode will not be to try and argue for or against mail-in voting, but rather to display the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. I will begin with the arguments opposed to mail-in voting, followed by the argument supporting it with a comparison at the end. The main argument that mail-in voting is bad is the one Trump has been continually echoing for months. Essentially, the idea that more mail-in voting will lead to more voter fraud and will produce an election result that is not as reliable. Essentially, there is a claim that it is far easier to exploit mail-in voting compared to in-person voting, as multiple ballots could be sent, double voting could take place, mail-in votes could be sent on behalf of someone who wasn't aware of it, and examples such as this. Furthermore, mail-in voting causes delays to the result of an election. This is one of the main reasons Republicans have pushed for a shorter deadline after Election Day for ballots to be received and counted. And it's the argument that mail-in voting makes the entire process complicated and unclear over who has won the election, as there could be weeks of delays for some states with long delays in receiving mail. Furthermore, the US Postal Service has been accused of not being able to handle the high number of ballots. Essentially, some claim the US Postal Service is not equipped to deal with high numbers of postal ballots that need to be turned over so quickly, and it is rare for such a high number of ballots or mail to be sent in such a short space of time, and therefore the US Postal Service just can't deal with it. And this claim is furthered going into the idea that states are not equipped to deal with such high numbers of mail-in voting, as the shift has come so quickly that states are not ready to deal with a high number of postal ballots, and as such they may not check properly for voter fraud, they may miscount voting ballots, they may missend ballots. For example, there was a case, I can't remember which state it was, but there were tens of thousands of ballots that had to be resent, and that's used as further proof to Republicans that states can't deal with this. Furthermore, voters are more likely to have their ballots not counted if they vote through mail, and therefore to be safe they should go in person. Mail-in voting has also been accused of being open to intimidation, as people mailing from their own homes may be more easily intimidated by others than an in-person ballot where they go into a booth and you can't be seen so they could lie. Therefore, people may abuse the system by intimidating others, and this is furthered by the claim that people may abuse the system by claiming to be someone they are not, or forcing ballots from that person. It is also considered by some to be unnecessary to change the system so much in response to COVID-19. Essentially, they argue that the system can be done properly and safely in person, and that there are too many costs regarding mail-in voting to the benefits to public health and safety. And finally, Trump has argued that mail-in voting favours the Democrats. This goes alongside his argument of voter fraud, essentially saying that you have this unfair system which is going to be mostly used by Democrats, and therefore is not fair to the Republican Party. Moving on then to the idea that mail-in voting is good. The evidence shows that there is virtually no fraud on the whole when it comes to postal ballots, as in the last few decades there have been extremely limited numbers of fraudulent voters. Yes, there are examples of ballots being missent and having to be recalled, but on the whole the actual amount of voter fraud is extremely low. Furthermore, delaying the result of the election by a week or so will not cause a massive problem. Essentially, the president does not take office until January of the year afterwards, and as such, there is a 2-month period whereby the result can be determined, and as such, there is no need to essentially claim that, if we delay the result of the election by a long time, it's going to cause loads of problems. And a lot of people argue that trying to shorten the period of allowing ballots to be received violates the right to vote and prevents a lot of people from being able to vote. And then this links into the Postal Service. Essentially, a lot of Democrats claim that the Postal Service can't cope because of Trump's actions. Essentially, earlier this year, a man known as DeJoy was made the postmaster of the US Postal Service, and he is a well-known Trump loyalist. and he has closed machines and limited the amount of overtime postal service workers can work, and as such, some would argue that he is creating a situation which favours Trump by reducing the capacity of mail-in voting to be done effectively. Furthermore, on the idea that states are not equipped to deal with mail-in voting, there are two arguments to this. Firstly, many would claim that they are, because they have had about 6 months at this point to prepare for mail-in voting, and they will be ready for it, and there has been mail-in voting in the past. It's not exactly a new idea, it's just being done in higher numbers, and therefore more faith should be put in states to deal with it. And furthermore, a lot of the actions that preventing states from being able to do it are being done by Republicans within those states, as far as the Democrats are concerned. For example, in Texas, the number of drop boxes for mail was greatly reduced, and that decision was essentially carried through after a Supreme Court decision, and therefore some would claim that it was actually the Republicans who were preventing Texas from being able to deal with postal votes because they are the ones limiting their capacity to do it. Then, the idea that voters can't check if their postal vote actually goes through. There are many ways to track post and ensure it is counted, and also there are mistakes. You can't argue that there will be mistakes done, but it's not strong enough of an argument to some people to prevent the whole idea of mail-in voting. Then, the idea of those being intimidated by others. You choose to vote through mail, so if you are being intimidated, you can essentially claim, or make the decision rather, to simply vote in person instead, and therefore it's not a massive problem and wouldn't cause a change in the result of an election as a result. Furthermore, on the idea of the health benefits and costs, it's down to the individual, and if the individual doesn't want to risk their health, they should not be forced to go in person to vote. Voting is one of the most basic rights people have in a democracy, and they shouldn't have to balance that against their own health, and what the Republicans are claiming, some would claim, is unfair in that regard. And finally, on the idea of it favouring Democrats, some would claim that this argument is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, yes, more Democrats are going to vote by mail, but they're still just going to vote. It's not as if there's a different way that mail-in voting is counted. It's all done the same way, and as such, there's still everyone voting. It's just done through a different method, and therefore some would claim that argument is irrelevant. Okay, so moving on to the comparison now. Firstly, on the idea of electoral fraud, those against postal ballots would say that more ballots by post will lead to more fraud. It's easier to commit fraud through post, and therefore when loads and loads, millions and millions of people are doing postal ballots, the election result cannot be relied upon. While those on the other side would say that the evidence shows that electoral fraud is very minimal when done by postal ballots and isn't intensely more than in person, and therefore even if you have tens, maybe hundreds, probably not, but tens of millions of people doing postal ballots, it won't cause the election to be fraudulent. On the idea of the postal system, those opposing postal ballots say that it can't cope and shouldn't be relied upon. It's going to cause problems, and therefore voting should, by the most part, be done in person, while those on the other side would say that it can't cope due to the actions of the Joy and the fact that he's actually limited the capabilities of the postal system, and that it's actually Trump and his allies who are trying to harm that. On the idea of states not being equipped, those in favour would just say states aren't ready to deal with such high numbers of ballots, and therefore there's going to be fraud, there's going to be missed ballots, it's going to cause loads of problems. Where those on the other side would say that it's the actions of the Republicans which are curtailing the state's efforts, and therefore either the states are still going to do well and just have more faith, or it's the actions of Republicans themselves who have caused the problems they are then claiming. On the idea of delays, those opposing postal ballots would say that it not only causes confusion and complications if results aren't known for a long time, but it can lead to preliminary decisions being wrong. If, for example, if Trump wins all of the in-person states, but then states that are done by postal ballot for Biden have been weeks later, it can cause problems. Well, those on the other side would say that it doesn't matter if you don't know the result of the election the day afterwards, even if it takes a week or 2 weeks to find out. You still got a month after that before the president takes office, and therefore all it's doing is preventing Trump potentially calling an early victory if he does win in person. On the idea of it being an overreaction to have loads of people voting via post, those in favour of this argument would say that public health shouldn't come over the elections, it's too extreme a response, while those on the other side would say that it is ultimately the individual's choice. If they don't want to risk their health and catch coronavirus going to vote, they shouldn't be forced to, and it's ultimately their right to vote which matters, and they should be able to vote however they so choose. On the idea of being able to track the vote or not, those opposing ballots would say that, by post, would say that it's probably going to get lost, people may not be able to vote, and therefore postal ballots are actually the ones preventing them being able to vote. Or those on the other side would say that it's only going to get lost due to the actions of Republicans. Yes, votes go wrong, things go wrong, but it's only going to happen on such a large scale because the postal service capabilities have been massively reduced. On the idea of essentially intimidation to vote, those agreeing with this would say that not having a secret ballot in person means that people are more open to being intimidated to vote, or those on the other side would say that it's a personal choice. If you are being intimidated, you can just go and vote in person, it's not credible enough to essentially shift the way that an election process is. Even there may be cases of intimidation, it won't be so widespread to force everyone to vote in person. And then finally, on the idea of it favouring one party, the Republicans and Trump would say that it's favouring the Democrats, and this fraudulent, unfair election is actually going to allow Biden to get in unlegitimately. Or those on the other side would say that everyone still votes. It's the means of voting that's changing. You're not suddenly having more people voting, although there is a belief essentially that if people are able to vote by post and they don't have to go out, more people may get out and vote, but ultimately they're still voting whether they voted in person or via post. They are still voting, and therefore that shouldn't dictate the result of the election. But overall, it ultimately comes down to Republicans tending to claim that mail-in voting is an overreaction and will harm the integrity of the election, while Democrats tend to claim that Republicans are trying to suppress people's right to vote by harming a system that would not favour them. They know that most people who vote by post will be Democrats, so if they can stop people voting by post, there will be less votes for the Democrats. It will be very interesting to see how this situation plays out, especially if Trump does indeed lose the election and then tries to use a massive amount of postal ballots to claim the election was not fair. But we will have to wait and see what happens in 5 days, actually quite close now, by the time of recording this, what happens. But anyway, what are your thoughts? Is there anything that I missed? Anything I got wrong? Anything I could do better? What's your thoughts on this topic? Is there also any topics you want to see? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments, and be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.